Until several weeks ago, we weren't too familiar with the Famicom Detective Club series, were we, Steve? We knew it encompassed a duo of visual novel adventure games originally released for the Famicom in the late 80s, as well as a third game that was brought to the Super Famicom Satellaview service in the late 90s, and we knew that one of its main characters was once planned to be a playable fighter in Smash Bros. Melee. But, due to their being Japan exclusive for over 30 years, we couldn't tell you much more about them, until now.
Exactly, Ash. Everything of course changed when Nintendo announced the first two titles in the Famicom Detective Club series, The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind, would be coming to the Switch as complete remakes. This means brand new visuals, rearranged soundtracks, full Japanese language voice acting, and newly localized scripts.
This is particularly exciting for Western players because these games represent a piece of Nintendo's early history that has been missing outside of Japan for more than 3 decades. And that makes sense, because as it turns out, both The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind feature a surprising amount of religious imagery, depictions of violence, and characters smoking cigarettes, the kind of quote-unquote mature content Nintendo of America was famously wary of throughout the 80s and early 90s.
Quirky as they are, the Famicom Detective Club games occupy an equally quirky place in Nintendo's Famicom lineup. They were made by R&D1, the same group responsible for Donkey Kong and Metroid. Looking at their history, these are the only visual novels R&D1, and indeed Nintendo as a whole, have ever released. Some of Nintendo's top talent of the era worked on these games. For example, they were written by Yoshio Sakamoto, who would go on to write and direct the Metroid series. Aside from Sakamoto, Gunpei Yokoi, the father of the Game & Watch and Game Boy, produced both games, with Sakamoto taking on Yokoi's role for these remakes.
And speaking of these remakes, how do we feel about them now that we've played through them in their entirety? To break things down a bit, I played The Girl Who Stands Behind while Steve tackled The Missing Heir. And as we compared notes throughout our playthroughs, it quickly became apparent that, though they are inextricably linked as a pair, the two games also offer surprisingly different narrative experiences, settings, characters, and themes.
That's right, Ash. What makes these two games interesting is that there's no wrong order to play them in, really. The Missing Heir is the first game in the series, having been released in 1988, but The Girl Who Stands Behind is a prequel despite releasing a year later in 1989. I started with The Missing Heir, which sees you taking on the role of an amnesiac detective. Your first mystery is that of your own identity. I found that to be a premise too interesting to pass up. As you attempt to regain your lost memories, you find yourself in the middle of a whodunit mystery involving a wealthy family, a suspicious death, and a grand inheritance that hangs in the balance. The closer I got to the center of the narrative puzzle, the more people around me started dying, throwing me off the scent of the killer, one at a time.
The Girl Who Stands Behind, meanwhile, has a bit more of a horror flavor to it and plays out like a combination murder mystery ghost story as you, a junior detective at the Utsugi Detective Agency, investigate the grisly murder of a local high school girl. Complicating things, though, is the fact that your investigation takes place amid rumors of the victim's school being haunted by what seems to be the blood-covered specter of another student, the titular Girl Who Stands Behind. But who is this girl, and is there really a supernatural element at play here? Is she connected to the student whose murder you're investigating? And speaking of that murder, who committed it?
For the most part, the stories in both The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind do a good job of answering the questions they present to you from a narrative standpoint. That said, there were a couple of key plot reveals, particularly in the later parts of each game, that left us disappointingly confused. Some plot elements toward the end of both games felt contrived, leading us to have a bit more trouble suspending our disbelief than we might have had otherwise. Still though, overall we enjoyed the stories in a general sense, and in particular Ash felt that The Girl Who Stands Behind delivered engaging twists and turns right up to the end.
Yeah, totally. While I will say that I had pretty accurately narrowed down the murder suspects by the game's final chapters, I was surprised by certain other plot revelations that are delivered at the very end of The Girl Who Stands Behind. There is more than the concept of a murder mystery connecting these two games, however. In both, you take on the role of an unnamed detective working for the aforementioned Utsugi Detective Agency. You're also joined by a key character named Ayumi Tachibana in both games. Ayumi takes on the role of your advisor, giving you a partner with whom to speculate about the clues you find, and she's a talented investigator in her own right.
She often unearths vital information about both cases, but her own development from a victim in The Girl Who Stands Behind to a hero in The Missing Heir makes her, in our opinion, one of the most interesting characters Nintendo has ever come up with. On top of her compelling narrative arc across the two games, she also just happens to be a skilled naginata wielder and enjoys heavy metal music. What other Nintendo character can you say that about? Maybe Sakurai was onto something when he wanted to make her playable in Smash, after all.
Considering how plot-focused these games are as visual novels, though, there's not much more we can say about their stories without delving into spoiler territory, and we want this review to remain as spoiler-free as possible. So let's move on to the other aspects of these remakes, starting with the actual gameplay they bring to the table. As interesting and engaging as the stories of The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind are, how fun are they to actually play?
Moment-to-moment gameplay is exactly what you would expect when you hear the term visual novel. Everything happens via contextual menu-based selections. If you want to explore an area, you'll do it by selecting an option on your menu. Same for talking to people, traveling between locations, investigating key areas in each environment, interacting with objects, you name it. Nintendo and development partner Mages didn't rethink the design of these games, and in a general sense we think that's a good thing. But in some ways it feels like more could have been done to update them for 2021 in a quality of life sense, with some dated gameplay elements showing the series' age.
Oftentimes, simply talking to characters quickly leads to revelations that move the story forward, and at those times the pacing of both games feels satisfyingly brisk. In addition, specific menu items will sometimes be highlighted in yellow, indicating that they're vital to moving forward with your investigation, but only sometimes. Just as often, you'll be left to figure out the very specific ways each game will allow you to progress entirely on your own, which would sometimes result in both Steve and I just selecting every available menu option and desperately hoping one of them would trigger some kind of progress. This kind of design was common for visual novels in the late 80s and is true to the originals, but we would have preferred to see some quality of life improvements on this front to alleviate the tedium we experienced when the next steps were a little too vague for their own good.
At one point during my playthrough of The Missing Heir, I spent a not insignificant amount of time poring over dialogue options, trying each one 2 or 3 times to ensure I hadn't missed anything. I used the look mechanic to scour every inch of the background looking for clues, only to find none. I inspected the characters in the area in a futile attempt to find some kind of detail that I had overlooked. Finally, after entirely too long looking at everything, I selected the option to quit my investigation out of frustration. In every instance aside from this one, quitting simply brings up a manual save menu. However, this one time, and this one time only, selecting this triggered unique dialogue. I didn't feel excited or accomplished by this revelation. Instead, I was just even more frustrated, despite finding what I needed. I put the game down that day anyway. This felt like more of a cruel joke than a victory.
Oh yeah, a very similar situation happened to me in The Girl Who Stands Behind as well, and it was a very frustrating, not at all rewarding experience. In another instance, I was talking to an NPC while waiting for another character to return from an errand they were on so I could interrogate them for more information, and my character reasoned that enough time had passed that he should check their office to see if they had returned. But there was no option for me to actually travel to their office and check, and instead I had to investigate a clock in the room I was currently in, only to find out it was broken, causing my character to wonder how much time had actually passed in the scene. Only after I had triggered that particular thought was I able to actually progress and continue my investigation.
Fortunately, these types of situations are relatively infrequent, and both games are mostly well-paced and fun to play more often than not. But even if these remakes don't always modernize the gameplay enough for our liking, their updated visuals, art, character designs, and soundtracks deliver in a big way, without exception. The backgrounds are beautifully illustrated, lending a sense of life to each scene that wasn't possible in the original Famicom versions. Characters are expressive and detailed throughout, though animation can look a bit stilted at times, particularly in The Girl That Stands Behind. Overall though, this is a great looking pair of games, and very often a feast for the eyes.
We're happy to report that Nintendo and Mages totally delivered on the music front as well, not only offering up a newly rearranged modern soundtrack for each game, but also including the original Famicom soundtracks for players who prefer to rock it old school. It's also worth noting that The Girl Who Stands Behind in particular was already remade once for the Super Famicom in 1998, and that version's soundtrack is also included here as well, underscoring just how much effort was put into giving players a truly complete musical experience here on the Switch. The different soundtrack versions can also be toggled between at any time during gameplay, and as a hardcore fan of video game music myself, I absolutely loved being able to compare and contrast the various soundtracks throughout the games.
Just as impressive though is the voice acting. As we mentioned earlier, each character, minor or major, is given fully voiced lines. I was often impressed by how well the voice cast conveyed emotion across the board. At moments where fear, anger, or sadness were called for, the actors involved invoked those feelings in extremely convincing ways. At some points in the story, I even felt uncomfortable as I listened to someone plead for my help in finding out who murdered someone close to them. Even if you don't speak Japanese, I'm certain some of the performances in these games will give you chills. Most impressive to me, however, is the fact that Yuko Minaguchi, who voiced Ayumi Tachibana in the 3rd installment of the Famicom Detective Club series, which still has yet to make its way west, by the way, Nintendo, is reprising her role for these remakes 24 years later. Voice acting adds another dimension of intrigue to these games that keeps them fresh even when pacing and progress are slowed down thanks to obscure menu options.
As you can see, we're scoring Famicom Detective Club The Missing Heir and Famicom Detective Club The Girl Who Stands Behind together. Though they can be played independently, we believe they shine most when played back-to-back as a duology. The narrative pacing does suffer at times, but just as quickly rebounds with compelling developments that keep you engaged and invested in finding out what's going to happen next. Meanwhile, the character and background art are uniformly beautiful, the voice acting is emotive, and the soundtracks are catchy without necessarily being memorable, fitting each game's tone and elevating their narratives. Overall, it's clear that quite a bit of care was taken in remaking these particularly obscure games from Nintendo's retro catalog, and there's more than enough to like here that we hope to see the third Famicom Detective Club game remade and localized in a similar vein in the future. Give us more Ayumi, Nintendo!
That wraps up our review of Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, and The Girl Who Stands Behind for Nintendo Switch. As always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to GVG and turn on notifications for more reviews, just like this one. We're Patreon funded, and if you're interested in supporting us, you can find out more at patreon.com/gvgaming. We'll see you next time. Bye!